Hello and welcome to Grow and Give, our modern Victory Garden project. We'll talk about a lot of different resources that you can help you learn to grow your food, share the harvest, and keep it local. Hello, welcome. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking about a few more things about seed starting. We're going to talk about how to germinate your seeds. We're going to discuss how to plan your schedule when you're deciding how you want to plant or how you want to start your seeds. We're going to talk about growing transplants and sowing your seeds outdoors. So let's get started. So when you're thinking about how to germinate seeds, you need to think of a couple different factors. All seeds require some combination of moisture, light, and air in order to signal the seed itself to start the germination process. Some seeds might need really good soil-to-seed contact with the soil, so you have to make sure that the conditions are right. And it's going to be very dependent on the type of seed that you're working with, what combination of conditions you need. For example, if you're planting a lettuce seed, they need a lot more light in order to get that signal to germinate along with moisture. So planting them at the soil surface where the light might filter through a little bit is going to be very important. For something like a pea, which is pictured on the right here, peas like to germinate when they're really, really warm. And so you want to make sure, you might even pre-germinate them. You can make a little germination chamber with a wet paper towel and a plastic bag or some kind of sealed container where you can actually get a little bit of germination before you plant the seedling. If you do this route, you have to be very careful about making sure you don't disturb the roots once you put them into the soil. The roots on a seedling have a lot of very, very tiny hairs on them called root hairs, which can be very delicate and very fragile. So you want to make sure when you're transplanting that you disturb that root as little as possible. We have some really good resources on the Colorado Master Gardener Garden Notes page, and this is a summary of the temperature that common vegetables like to germinate at. So if you take a look, you can see that beets, broccoli, cabbage, they can germinate at temperatures as low as 40 degrees. Optimal temperatures are as high are 80 degrees. If it's up above 90 degrees, then they're not really going to want to germinate. Other things like your leaf lettuces are going to germinate very cool, as low as 35 degrees, but they like to germinate at 70 degrees. If it's higher than 70 degrees, they're not going to do very well. So this chart is a useful thing to look at, and this is why in the previous webinar I talked about the importance of heat mats. If we're starting our seeds inside, very few of us keep our house warm enough to have the optimal germination temperature. This is especially true for the warm season plants like peppers and tomatoes that we work with. Peppers, I've done this experiment in my own seed starting. I tried germinating peppers without a heat mat in my basement, which was at about 65 degrees, and it took over a month before I got germination. And at that point, germination was relatively spotty. Once I put a heat mat in, I got germination within 2 weeks. So it really can make a substantial difference to make sure that that soil temperature is an ideal temperature. If you're planting outside, soil temperatures are important too. You can test the temperature of your soil outside very easily if you have an old meat thermometer. Make it a dedicated garden temperature thermometer instead of exchanging it back and forth between the gardens, so you don't have to worry about sterilization and all of that. But you can use a meat thermometer to test the soil temperature, usually at least 6 inches down, so that you know approximately where your soil temperatures are at. Usually you're not going to get good germination with directly sown seeds for our warm season crops, which are on the right hand column here, if you don't have soil temperatures at least up in the 60-degree area. In terms of germination time of our vegetable seeds, it can vary fairly substantially, but generally speaking, 7 to 10 days is a pretty good bet. Obviously, assuming that your conditions are ideal. If you take a look here, for example, some things take a little bit longer to germinate. Like a carrot is going to take 10 to 17 days to germinate. And so you're going to want to make sure that you kind of calculate that in when you're planning your planting schedule. But some things germinate really, really quickly. Lettuce can take as little as 4 days to germinate. Some of the brassicas, if you look, the broccoli, cabbage, kohlrabi, those can take as little as 3 days to germinate. And so it can be a relatively quick process, provided that you're giving the right conditions to the plant. And this chart just gives you a lot of useful information in terms of days to germination, and then how long it takes from germination to harvest, and generally at what age, if you do it as a transplant, at what age it would be optimal to transplant. So if you look at things like the broccoli, you might want to transplant at 5 to 7 weeks, whereas with a summer squash, you might transplant in as little as 2 weeks. That's because squash have very, very tender roots, and they become more tender the larger the plant gets. So you want to transplant it as quickly as possible once those true leaves have emerged. So when you're planning your schedule, it's important to know a couple of different things. If you do start too soon, I have a coworker who does this. He starts his tomatoes in February, and it's just too early. By the time it's late May and you're ready to start transplanting, you have a tree for a tomato, and transplant stress and transplant shock is going to be a big problem. So generally speaking, you want to make sure that your plants are of an appropriate size to transplant. And this varies from plant to plant. With a tomato, usually you don't want more than maybe 7 true leaves on the plant. If you have a few more, it's not going to be problematic, but if you have a tree size of a tomato, then it's going to be problematic. Alternately, if you start too late, the plants might not be strong enough to survive transplant, or they might not have the root system established to transplant effectively. When you're thinking about your schedule, the date that you measure by is generally your last frost date. Around a lot of Colorado, especially where I'm at on the Front Range, mid-May, Mother's Day, is generally around when our last frost date is. You can contact your local extension office and find out what your local area's last frost date is and calculate from that day. That said, last frost date means the last date at which you're usually going to get a frost. It doesn't mean it's the guaranteed last time we will get a cold event. So going by soil temperatures and going by other by what the actual weather in your area is doing is going to be a much better bet. Generally speaking, for example, here along the Front Range, we recommend that while the last frost date is Mother's Day, planting our warm season crops is usually best pushed off until a little bit later, such as the end of May and around Memorial Day. And then usually we have a relatively decent season. Our first frost date is usually sometime in early October, although I have known it as early as mid-September. So planning for your season via your frost dates is an important way to do it. This kind of is similar thing. You want to look first at those frost dates. You want to look at how long it takes your seed to germinate, and then how long until that seedling is developed if you're going to be doing transplants, and how long that plant takes to get to maturity. Your packet should tell you when you should be starting inside, if starting inside is an important thing. So general guidelines for starting seedlings inside, and note that germination time is not included in this. Generally speaking, for 2 to 4 weeks is cucumbers, melons, squash, and lettuce. And to grow 5 to 7 weeks are broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, tomatoes. Longer, at 6 to 9 weeks, are eggplants, leeks, onions, peppers, some herbs. And 10 plus weeks, many flower varieties and some other herbs might take over 10 weeks to get ready to become successful transplants. So here's an example slide for figuring this out. So we'll look at everybody's favorite. You've got your standard slicer tomato. Germination usually takes 1 to 2 weeks, somewhere in the 6 to 14 days range. The seedlings grow for about 6 weeks, somewhere in the 5 to 7 week range. So total seedling time, you add that 6 weeks to the 1 to 2 weeks, you're looking at 7 to 8 weeks to get your seedlings to the point where you can really transplant them effectively. Days to maturity is going to be 11 weeks. This particular variety we were looking at was 77 total days. Do note that seedlings might slow down in their growth due to transplant shock, or if you plant them in cold soils, especially tomatoes are susceptible to sulking in the soil if you plant them and the soil temperatures are cold. Even if it was a big plant, especially if it was a big plant and you plant it in cold soil, that's going to slow them way down, and that total day estimate is going to lengthen. So make sure that you keep your current climate and temperatures in account when you're planning getting things planted. You can always warm your soil with something like a wall of water or a plastic mulch, or a raised bed generally has warmer soils than an in-ground bed. If you're thinking about fertilization, like I talked about in the previous webinar, seeds in the early stages have all of the nutrients they need to get them started. So you want to wait to fertilize until after you see that first true set of leaves come out. There are specific starter fertilizers that are specialized for use on transplant seedlings. You want to make sure that you mix it at a very low concentration. It usually will have a higher level of phosphorus than it will of potassium, and it will have a little bit, slightly less, but still a large amount of nitrogen. Another option is when you are potting your seedlings from a very tiny container into a larger container, that's a time to mix your fertilizer into the media. You charge that media with fertilizer so that you can transplant your plant into media that already has fertilizer mixed into it. So we'll look at here a few common problems that you might have with seed starting. You can look some common things that you might see are growth of algae or fungus on the soil surface. If your seedlings pinch off and break at the soil surface, if your seedlings are long and spindly, what if your seed packet got wet and is old, or if your seedlings are yellow. Now, for the yellow seedlings, it's important to distinction whether the cotyledon is, or whether it's the cotyledons or if it's the new growth. And on the next slide, we'll kind of go through what. So here is the options that you have for what to do with some of these problems. So if you have algae or fungus on your soil surface, it generally means that the container you're growing in is too moist. If you have a humidity dome over the top, it's probably a good idea to crack that a couple of times a day and let a little bit of air in, or take it off for an hour and let things kind of air out and dry out. If your seedlings are pinching or breaking at the soil surface, it's usually a problem called the dampening off fungus. To solve this, unfortunately for the seedlings that have already dampened off, there's nothing you can do. But for future uses, make sure that you're using a sterile soil. It's usually easiest just to purchase a seed starting mix from your local nursery or a big box store, but you can also sterilize yourself if you are so inclined. If your seedlings are long and spindly, it's important to increase the amount of light. If your seed packet got wet or is old, do a germination test. Put 10 seeds on a wet paper towel in a plastic bag or in a humidity tent, and see after a few days how many start to actually grow. If none of them do, then they may have already started that germination process and got dried out, and so they are no longer viable seeds. If your seedlings are yellow, if the cotyledon is yellow, it's perfectly normal. The plant has sucked all of the nutrients out of that cotyledon that it can, and they're going to drop off and it's fine. If your new growth is yellow, then you might have a issue or an imbalance with either nutrients or with light. So try increasing light. You want your grow light to be almost touching those seedlings. Maybe if that doesn't work, then you give it a little shot of some extra nitrogen. If you have more questions, you can definitely check out the Grow and Give website or contact your local CSU Extension office.